Hi, welcome to this week's episode of Israel Undiplomatic. This week we have a slightly different format. I'm your host, Ruthie Blum, as usual, but my co-host, Mark Regev, happens to be on a lecture tour in North America, so he'll be joining us from there. Hi, Mark.
How are you? I'm speaking to you from a hotel room somewhere in Virginia.
Somewhere in Virginia. Well, let's get to it then, because, this has been a really difficult week, and especially the last few days. And I would like to talk about UNIFIL, our troops, our supposed peacekeeping troops that were supposed to guarantee that Hezbollah, the terrorist organization in Lebanon, remained unarmed and didn't pose a threat to Israel for 18 years. And this week, I think one of the reasons we need to talk about the horrible things that have been happening from Lebanon is that Hezbollah has been bombarding Israel with drones, and one of them killed several soldiers yesterday and wounded dozens of others.
Correct. It was at a Golani training base near Binyamina, which is the center of the country, and a UAV or a drone, I never know what the difference is. There was an attack on the base they were, and 4 soldiers, unfortunately, were killed. And it's very sad. And as you will recall, Ruti, just before Yom Kippur, I think it was Friday, we heard of 3 Israeli soldiers and others injured in an incident not in Lebanon, but in Gaza. So it's been a difficult week. 3 and then 4 yesterday. It's a difficult time, and it just makes us aware. I think it makes us understand we will win this war. We will win this war because we've got no choice, and we have to win this war. There's no alternative to winning the war. We must. But there's a price to be paid, and we feel that very much today with these 4 Golani soldiers who are in their training.
Well, it's a little difficult. We definitely have to win the war, and we will win it. But it's a little difficult when our so-called friends in the international community, namely the United Nations in particular.
I don't think, Ruthie, the United Nations was ever a real friend.
That's a good point, especially you should know, as you teach a course on the United Nations at the Reichman University. But I would like to say that we see in Gaza and in Lebanon. In Gaza, we have UNRWA, supposedly to worry about the educational and humanitarian needs of these so-called Palestinian refugees. And in Lebanon, UNIFIL, the troops that were supposed to keep the peace along the Lebanon-Israel border, and they have been there for 18 years and have done nothing. So the reason I'm bringing that up is that suddenly, because of Israeli operations in southern Lebanon, 2 UNIFIL soldiers from Sri Lanka were wounded in an Israeli strike on Hezbollah targets, Hezbollah tunnels and weapons caches. And that is how the UNIFIL soldiers were wounded. They didn't need to be. Israel urged the UNIFIL troops to please get out of harm's way, get out of the battle zone. But the UN refused to evacuate them. And meanwhile, and again, the world suddenly is attacking Israel for so supposedly targeting UNIFIL troops, which is, of course, nonsense. And I would like to ask the world where they were all these 18 years when Hezbollah was amassing all these weapons. How come nobody mentioned that? And where was UNIFIL? And suddenly, Israel is being attacked for supposedly targeting those troops.
So as you know, I'm in North America, and as a result, I'm listening to news in North America. And of course, there was even one reporter who said that Israel is accused of targeting the UN. And of course, there could be nothing further from the truth. If inadvertently, unfortunately, regrettably, UN personnel have been caught up in the crossfire between Israel and Hezbollah, that is, of course, unfortunately, a reality of combat. I don't want to tell you how many Israeli soldiers have, since this war began, have been hit, unfortunately, by what's called friendly fire, blue on blue, so to speak. And that's why I think we were correct in suggesting we can't order the UN, but we suggested that they leave a combat zone. They were there, supposedly, to keep the peace. Now, we can talk about the failure of their mission in a moment. But it's clear there's no peace at the moment to be kept, and it's a combat zone. And I think from everyone's point of view, it's probably better that they were not there at the moment, temporarily, to redeploy. The trouble is, and just as Hezbollah uses schools and mosques and all sorts of civilian infrastructure as a human shield for its terror war machine, it has also used the UN. And I remember in previous rounds of fighting, there were always countless examples of Hezbollah using the proximity of UN forces, UN facilities in Lebanon to protect their own terrorists, to protect their war machine. And here it must be said, and you said it very correctly, Ruthie, according to the UN, there should be no Hezbollah armed forces whatsoever south of the Litani River. That's a UN Security Council resolution. Supposedly, the UN forces in Lebanon were supposed to enforce that resolution. And of course, what can we say? It's an abysmal failure. I don't know exactly what these UN forces were doing in Lebanon, but they definitely were not making sure that Hezbollah didn't have a military presence south of Litani. It's clear to everyone the opposite is true.
Well, which leads me to wonder, and I do more than wonder, yes, whether UNIFIL is in cahoots with Hezbollah. And if not openly in cahoots with Hezbollah, at least purposely looking the other way, allowing Hezbollah to amass weapons. You know, when you see where the UNIFIL bases are, where the command post is, the main one, it's about 100 yards from Hezbollah tunnels and terror caches. It is impossible that UNIFIL did not know what was going on with those Hezbollah terrorists. Impossible for 18 years. And during those 18 years, Hezbollah amassed something like 150,000 rockets, drones, right, and missiles. It is impossible that UNIFIL did not know about it. So the question is, were they cooperating with Hezbollah? Were they giving Hezbollah information about Israeli movements? And at this point, I have no sympathy for them because we did warn them. And you know that Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday, he urged the UN Secretary General to please evacuate those troops from the battle zone. But instead, Antonio Guterres preferred to say that we're committing war crimes, as he usually does. This is outrageous.
So I would say the following. I don't think UNIFIL its presence is nefarious. Yes, I don't think they're evil. I think there are probably a lot of soldiers from different countries around the world who they think they're doing a good job. But I think by any criteria, their job has been a massive failure. And when this is over, and Israel will have, through the sacrifice of our soldiers, we will have demilitarized southern Lebanon. And we've spoken about this before on the podcast. We have to make sure that it remains demilitarized, that Hezbollah doesn't return. And I think there won't be many people in Israel that will have any confidence whatsoever in the UN's ability to enforce that demilitarization. And ultimately, it'll be incumbent upon us, on Israel, to ensure that South Lebanon remains an area free of Hezbollah. Now, that the UN theoretically supports that goal, that's wonderful. But if the UN's not going to implement it, and we've had, as you said, 18 years or more where that goal has not been implemented, so I think it's up to Israel to make sure.
Yeah, and by the way, UNIFIL's mandate was renewed in August. I mean, it beggars belief. Those troops do nothing. Now, let's say you want to give the troops the benefit of the doubt and they think they're doing a good job, whatever that job is. They're certainly not doing their job, but maybe they're nice guys and all that. But what is it with the countries who sent those troops there? We have countries like Italy, the UK, Ireland, accusing us of war crimes, accusing us or warning us that we have to be careful not to target UN forces. Now, how dare they suggest that? First of all, we never target civilian outposts. Not that UNIFIL are troops, but they're not hostile troops to us. Or maybe they are. I'm beginning to think they are. But one thing for sure is that the UN is a hostile body towards Israel. Its Secretary General makes no secret of that. So here's my question to you as someone who teaches a course on the UN. I don't know how you do that impartially, but I would like to ask, what do we need it for? And why does Israel have to be a member of it? And why does America allow it to be sitting in New York? That's what I'd like to know, why it isn't shut down. It wastes so much money, and all it does is promote bad actors in the world.
So I'll answer the first part of what you raise first. One of the problems, you say that all these governments in Europe, including the British, were criticizing Israel for the way we were behaving in South Lebanon and the injuries of the UN personnel. But all those governments, they're basing their actions on UN reports. And unfortunately, this is the tip of the iceberg. Because UN reports, we know in Israel, Israelis across the political spectrum agree that the UN is a biased, it's institutionally anti-Israel. Some would even argue institutionally anti-Semitic, that it has this built-in bias in all its form. But it churns out all these papers, all these reports. And unfortunately, though the UN has very little credibility in Israel, and even in the United States, the UN is often seen as this bloated international bureaucracy. But in much of the world, I beg to say in most of the world, the UN has this holier-than-thou status. The UN Secretary General is almost like a secular pope. He represents the moral conscience of humanity for many, many people. And so when the UN churns out these anti-Israel reports, people don't know about the institutional bias in the United Nations. They think, oh, the UN says Israel is in the wrong. We believe the UN. The UN has a special status. Its branding is very good, and not just in Western countries. It's even stronger when you go to what is called today the global South, what used to be called the Third World. There, the UN's status is even higher, and so we face in dealing with the UN a problem that you've got an institution that is fundamentally anti-Israel, and yet globally it has a status which is seen as a do-gooder.
Well, I'd say follow the money trail, by the way. These organizations, you talk about reports. Wow, you know how much funding goes into those reports. And by the way, I think that when you were talking about the third world countries, I don't even need to call them by some other euphemism. They know very well that they're anti-Israel, but it's not just anti-Israel. They're anti-West altogether. And that Western leftists jump on that bandwagon is just atrocious. But, it is a corrupt institution, and it's a joke. I mean, I think it was Qatar was just recently appointed to the Human Rights Council. You had Iran on the Committee for Women's Rights or whatever. It's a joke, but it's a joke that earns all of these people a lot of money. And, I would be very curious to know how much Mr. Guterres, Mr. Pope, secular Pope, earns, by the way.
So I think it's important for our viewers, for our listeners, for the people who follow Israel Undiplomatic to know the depth of UN hostility to Israel. In the General Assembly, where every nation is equal, in the General Assembly of the United Nations, routinely, there are these anti-Israel resolutions, some 20 every year, that pass automatically with whopping majorities. And, maybe 4 or 5 countries voting against them, and the Europeans will often abstain, yes, but this is supposedly representing the conscience of the world. Yes, this is world public opinion. And once again, all these resolutions, and some of them are so ludicrous in the fact that they're so biased, so one-sided, and yet they pass automatically with these huge majorities. Then you've got, Ruthie, your friends, the UN Human Rights Council, where, as you said, you have sitting and judging the only democracy in the Middle East, to some countries with the most atrocious human rights records on the planet. And what is the truth? Since its establishment, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations has spent more time attacking Israel than any other country. We're worse than North Korea, we're worse than Russia, we're worse than China, we're worse than Assad's Syria. In fact, the statistics are even more damning. The United Nations Human Rights Council spent more time attacking and condemning Israel than all the other countries combined. It's not just most resolutions, it's more resolutions than everyone else together. If that doesn't show bias.
So bias, that word doesn't do it justice. Then it's biased. It's worse than that. It is a hostile, anti-Semitic entity. And any Western country that gives it credibility, I think, should be ashamed. And as I said, I think the United States, it's about time that the United States kick it out of New York City and say, we want no part of this. And I don't think Israel should be a part of it either. I've thought that a long time. Now, of course, we know it. That depends very much on which United States administration is in power at a given time. But one thing we know is that even today, we have Vice President Kamala Harris, I think it was today or yesterday, came out again warning us against how we haven't provided enough humanitarian aid in Gaza. Nonsense. We provide all this aid, and then Hamas steals it, threatens the humanitarian corridors, tries to shoot any Gazan who wants to get at the aid or the food. And furthermore, again, where is Kamala Harris when it comes to attacking, to saying how disastrous it is that Hamas is still able to do anything like that in Gaza? It is always look for Israel, look to Israel, look at Israel, and let's find something that Israel did wrong. And I have to say, Israel has done nothing wrong since October 7th last year, nothing. All we have done has been attacked from all sides and within, and tried very, very hard to defend ourselves and fight the enemy, and hurt the fewest amount of civilians. And a lot of good it did us. So, I know that some of your friends think that I just go way too far, but I will now again. I think we need to kill as many enemies as we can. We need to be less careful about killing civilians. We need to warn them all to get out of the way. But anybody who doesn't is unfortunately fair game, because it's them or us, and our existence is at stake, especially when you have the UN creating a chorus of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic rhetoric and punitive measures in international courts. Enough already.
So I beg to disagree on one thing that you've said, maybe more than one, but I want to take issue publicly with on one. When you said that Israel should leave the UN, the Prime Minister recently addressed the United Nations, and he reminded everyone who was there that the first time he addressed the General Assembly as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, that was back in the 1980s, there was a motion proposed by the Palestinians to have Israel thrown out. And apparently the Palestinians have retabled this idea to throw Israel out of the UN. And I would urge you not to play according to Abbas's rules. They would be very, very happy if we gave up the bully pulpit, if we lost our defenses of the United Nations. With all its problems, I think we have to stay there and fight. I don't think we pull out. That's my opinion. But I want to make sure people watching this podcast know that it's not just Mark Regev and Ruthie Blum who are critical of the United Nations and the way its obsession, its negative obsession with Israel, this automatically ganging up on Israel. Two previous Secretary Generals of the organization have admitted publicly, both Ban Ki-moon and Kofi Annan, both publicly addressed anti-Israel bias at the UN. And these are the people who stood at the top of the institution. Unfortunately, the current Secretary General of the United Nations, instead of being aware of the problem of institutional bias against Israel, seems to embrace that institutional bias. And of course, we've mentioned it, but we haven't really gone into any detail about UNRWA. And UNRWA portrays itself, yes, as the organization that offers humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian refugees and so forth. But UNRWA's a huge problem. And unfortunately, a lot of the bad things going on in Gaza is because of UNRWA. And we can't forget this. And, every time we catch UNRWA people involved in terrorism, involved in Hamas, so the UNRWA leadership and the United Nations does a commission of inquiry or some internal sort of investigation, and that's always their attitude is, well, it's a few bad apples and we'll deal with that. No, it's not a few bad apples. And the documentation is clear. Ruthie, you know that there were hostages who were held in Gaza in the homes of UNRWA officials. You know, Ruthie, that when the Hamas terrorists crossed the border and massacred and raped and beheaded and burned people alive, there were UNRWA employees amongst them. You know, Ruthie, that the teachers in UNRWA schools have a Facebook and a WhatsApp group. And on October 7th, they celebrated the massacre. These are the UN-paid staff who are teaching the next generation of Palestinian children, teaching them to become terrorists, teaching them to hate Jews. This is what UNRWA is all about. If it was one thing, you could say, okay, maybe it is possibly an aberration. It's not an aberration. It's not a few bad apples. The institution, to its very core, has this anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic bias, and the institution has to be changed. The current UNRWA...
Excuse me, Mark. Excuse me. First of all, the previous administration in Washington defunded UNRWA, and the current administration refunded it. It's not that it needs to be changed. It needs to be abolished. UNRWA doesn't even have a right to exist anyway because it has special status, the Palestinian refugees, so-called. No other people in the world has refugee status after settling in countries for several generations. Only the Palestinians. UNRWA has no right to exist, even if it weren't basically a terrorist organization in collusion with Hamas, even if it weren't. Even if it didn't participate in the October 7th massacre, it has no reason for existing altogether. It has no reason for collecting all those funds. It is corrupt, rotten to the core. And it's not just anti-Semitic. It is pro-terror, and it should be abolished. You say, well, we should stay and fight. I know that argument. That argument, it works for a lot of people. A lot of people say that about, for example, about their political parties. No, I want to change it from within. We'll change it. The UN is not going to change because it has a majority of these countries that hate the West or certainly hate Israel. And yes, we don't need to be kicked out by the Palestinians, kicked out of the UN. We should leave of our own volition and fight from the outside because, as I said, it's rotten, it's corrupt, it's evil. I know, Mark, you don't like that word evil, but I have no problem with it, especially not since October 7th. I'd like to say we are now in a battle between good and evil. The UN is on the side of evil, including countries that really will be the next target of these Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran. It's all from Iran, by the way. And but I just would like to add one more thing. As you know, right now, Israelis are sitting on the edge of our seats, waiting to find out what moves the government and army have prepared for Iran, how we're going to strike Iran. What is it we're about to do?
So we can talk about Iran in a second. I just wanted to mention one more thing about the refugee issue, the Palestinian refugee issue. UNRWA has refugee camps across the Middle East, but they have them also, as you know, in Gaza and in the West Bank. Now, from a Palestinian perspective, Gaza and the West Bank are part of Palestine, correct, Ruthie? And so why are there refugee camps when people are, from their own perspective, in their homeland? And there's only one answer. The answer is, well, we say that these refugees have to go back to be in what is now Israel, and that should also be Palestine. And this just shows you part of the agenda that they have there at UNRWA, which is crazy. There's one organization at the UN, the High Commissioner of Refugees and so forth, that they deal with refugees from Syria and from crises across the world. And they're professionals, and they deal with refugees in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America.
I don't know. You can say
but UNRWA has a special status. It is the only organization that is designed for one specific group of people. It's the amount of money spent on Palestinian refugees is huge. And what is the real problem? That UNRWA's mandate, the job of the UN in dealing with other refugees, is to offer them assistance and help them get resettled. UNRWA says publicly, no, it's against resettlement. It's against integrating refugees into the economy and the society of a host country. In fact, what does UNRWA say? They want to perpetuate the refugee issue, Palestinian refugee status, until these people can return back to their homes in, they will say, Palestine.
Well, exactly. But this is why what I'm trying to say is I also don't trust the status of refugees elsewhere. Anything connected to the UN these days is suspect. And I would like to say, after all that UNRWA talk, we get back to bring us back to the beginning with UNIFIL. I don't see how we can trust for 1 second that UNIFIL doesn't have also a bad agenda, because it certainly never applied its mandate, never fulfilled it, and is now taking the opportunity to attack Israel for defending itself along the border that UNIFIL was supposed to protect. So I don't trust that organization any more than I trust UNRWA.
So I'd say the following, Ruthie. There's been a UN force on the Golan Heights that was part of the famous 1974 Interim agreement that Henry Kissinger, in his shuttle diplomacy between Damascus and Jerusalem, there was a UN force that separated us and the Syrians. And until Syria started to fall apart in the civil war, it actually did a decent job, because it did keep the agreement. And if you've got two parties that want to keep the agreement, the UN can be a sort of a way that you can coordinate things and do a good job. That's not the situation in UNIFIL. That's different. I'm just giving an example of where the UN maybe can have a positive role. The trouble is, UNRWA and UNIFIL, there are so many examples of the UN being atrocious in its behavior towards Israel that it eclipses the one or two examples where the UN does a good job, and that's the truth. Can I just say one thing more about refugees? I know you wanted to move on, but please allow me. If we walk down the street in Israel, and walk down the street in Tel Aviv where you live, Ruthie, and you see people, and it's often forgotten. And I'm speaking in abstract terms here, but let's say 8 out of 10 Israelis on the street are either refugees, the children of refugees, or the grandchildren of refugees. This whole country was founded by people who came here fleeing persecution, fleeing genocide. This is a country that created a homeland for one of the most persecuted peoples that history has ever known. And yet there are no refugees. Everyone's been integrated. Everyone's been, the children and grandchildren of refugees are prime ministers, and they are generals in the army, and they are living in a free country, and they've, become upwardly mobile. And as Israel's moved ahead, our population has moved ahead. The whole idea that for political reasons, Palestinian refugees have been prevented from reintegrating into host countries and been kept in refugee camps, it really is a crime against the Palestinian people and all those involved in that. The UN and the Arab states who perpetuated this. It's disgusting.
It's another version of using the Palestinians as human shields, because what you're doing is you're keeping them downtrodden. You're keeping them in a refugee status in refugee camps. You want them to be poor. You want them to be miserable in order to accuse Israel of crimes it didn't commit. And in order to say, you see, this is what it is, using them as pawns. And it's unacceptable. We know that. And unfortunately, what we're hoping, I don't see how it's going to happen unless the entire education system changes. But that's a little difficult when UNRWA was in charge of education of Palestinians. And the idea is that they shouldn't want to be refugees. They should want to be upwardly mobile. They should want to have peace with their neighbors. All of those, nice things. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, depends on how you look at it, I don't see any other so-called peacekeeping force that is effective at all anywhere other than the state of Israel and our army. And I mean that in Gaza, and I mean that in Lebanon, all around our borders, anywhere we need to have control, or even not only control so that we're not killed, but also to release other people from their leaders to enable us to have any kind of chance at peace with them. Certainly, they have no chance of any kind of life with terrorists running the show and with you and with the United Nations perpetuating their problems.
And the truth is, if you look at the different peace agreements between Israel and the Arab countries, the UN had practically nothing to do. I mean,
exactly.
Maybe the UN contributed in 1948-49 to the armistice agreements between the neighboring states, but since then, the UN's role in peacemaking between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt, the Abraham Accords, the UN was largely irrelevant, which is damning. The organization in charge of, supposedly in charge of world peace, has been irrelevant. It's been missing in action when it comes to the peace between Israel and our Arab neighbors. And can I just say...
that's being generous, because you say missing in action. And I say, no. They're in action, all right. They're in action. This is purposeful. Okay, you could continue. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I look forward to continuing this discussion next week, when I will actually be sitting next to you in the studio like usual in Jerusalem, Ruthie.
Happily. I'm glad we got a chance to do it this way to see what it's like, but I prefer having you across from me so that I can browbeat you in person.
But I browbeat back, don't I?
You do. So on that note, I hope you have the happy holidays, the rest of your holidays.
And I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye then.
Bye.